I think we can start now. Good evening. My name is Geneviève Zubrzycki. I'm the Weiser Family Professor in European and Eurasian Studies and the William H. Sewell Jr. Collegiate Professor of Sociology, and I direct the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia here at the University of Michigan. We're very glad to have you here today to discuss European elections. Although the results may not be as pleasant as we might like to have them be as a form of distraction. Actually, we are almost 1 week since the US presidential election, and we're starting to see also cabinet choices that will influence European politics and policies. Although this is not the topic of this evening's panel, this is something that we should consider together as a group, perhaps in the Q&A. Today is November 11th, which is also Polish Independence Day. And it's almost, or no, actually, it is a year after Poland's parliamentary elections, where a coalition of opposition parties defeated the far-right populist Law and Justice. And the current government is now engaged since a full year in the complicated work of restoring the rule of law and restoring also democratic institutions damaged by 8 years of democratic backsliding. So actually, elections are not enough to undo what some administrations can do. And the Polish case, although encouraging from a liberal democratic standpoint, is also pointing to the fact that it's not as easy as just voting and being done, that there's actually quite a bit of work, especially when the justice system is involved and courts are involved. The Polish, the presidential elections are also decided to be in May 2025, and we will see also what the results of those elections might be. And since the Polish president has a veto, it's also important to see they also have quite a bit to say. So this is not done in Poland, and this is also something for us to think about, even though we had time to think about it, and we decided as a nation collectively to go a different way last week. In Germany, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, a far-right populist party that is so-called Eurosceptic and opposes immigration to Germany, especially immigration of Muslims, has made considerable gains last June, winning 16% of the vote in the European Parliament elections. Second only to the CDU, and gaining almost 5% percentage points in relation to the 2019 election. So that party has gained in prominence over time. This is also something that we have seen in France, and Professor Cole will be talking about this more specifically. But in both France and Italy, the far right has also made incredible progress. The Brothers of Italy won over 26% of the vote in the recent legislative elections, making the party leader, Giorgia Meloni, Prime Minister of Italy. The party gained a few more points in the European parliamentary elections, garnering 29% of the vote. So this is almost, close to a third of the vote. In France, the Rassemblement National won the most delegates of any single party in the 2024 European parliamentary elections on June 9th. And interpreting that result as a vote of non-confidence, President Macron dissolved the National Assembly and called a new legislative election, hoping that the result would bring a fear of God, so to say, or the secular God in voters. And encourage them to vote for his centrist, quote-unquote, centrist party. And he lost that wager when a coalition of right-wing and far-right parties won the largest share of the vote in the first round of the elections, with 33.15% of the vote. So the expectation was clearly that in the second round, the far-right Rassemblement National of Marine Le Pen would win. And it is only after massive mobilization and a lot of political games, intricate games, which involved also of candidates for specific parties that might actually help by remaining in the race, help the RN to come to power, dropping out of the elections, that then a coalition of leftist parties managed to block the Rassemblement National from coming to power. In the UK, so we might see another bit of hope, Labour won the July 7th elections, but that summer the country experienced an unprecedented wave of anti-immigrant violence and riots. So there's a lot there's a lot on the table for us to ponder, discuss, and perhaps debate. And we have today 3 experts on 3 societies. So I will start with Joshua Cole, who's professor of history at the University of Michigan. His research and teaching deals primarily with the social and cultural history of France in the 19th and 20th century, and he's published work on gender in the history of population sciences, colonial violence, and the politics of memory in France, Algeria, and also in Germany. Giulia Riccò, yes, is assistant professor of Italian here at U of M. Her book, New World Italians, The Invention of a Brazilian Identity, traces the discursive production in a modern, racialized Italian identity in Sao Paulo, Brazil. She's the co-editor of the 2020 Radical History Review, an issue dedicated to fascism and anti-fascism since 1945. In 2021, Giulia received the Italian Scientists and Scholars of North America Foundation inaugural award for innovation in the study of Italian culture. And on the screen behind this, you will see appear Scott Greer, who's professor of health management and policy, global public health and political science at U of M. He researches the ways in which political systems operate and shape health policy decisions. He's done extensive research on a variety of topics, including the politics of public health and disaster response, federalism, science policy, and European integration. He conducts research on the European Union, United Kingdom, and the United States in particular. And we're very glad that he's here. He's not feeling very well, but he made it on Zoom. He might have a runny nose or, cough a couple times, but we're extremely grateful for him to make it to his computer. And I want to convey Professor von Moltke's apologies for not being here today talking about Germany because of a family emergency. So I would like to welcome Professor Cole to the podium to talk about France. Thank you.
Thank you, Geneviève. Thank you for coming. So we are clearly living through a moment. And my task is to talk about French politics. As Geneviève said, the extreme right wing of the French political spectrum has made enormous gains over the past few years, and these were consolidated this summer. And my job today is to provide you with a little background to try and help you understand why this is a big moment in France, okay? Some of you may have seen the article in the New York Times last week after the election here that Donald Trump's victory represents a transition, a moment in which parties that were organized around economic interest or socioeconomic divisions in society has given way to parties that represent one or the other side in our highly polarized culture wars. You may have seen it's an argument that has a certain kind of plausibility to it. And I want to say that I looked at that and I said, they have always had debates about the culture wars in France, going back to 1789. And I want to sort of bring that out here, that this is not what is happening in France, certainly that transition. So I'm going to talk about the French elections in 2024. And to do this, I actually want to give you a before picture, okay? We're going to go way back to the 1980s, and I'm going to give you, how do I get this to go? Is this on? How do I get this to advance?
Try now. No?
There we go. Press the right-hand side. Which one did you press? Oh, you went backwards.
Can we get...
There we go. So this button, right? Yes. So this is the before picture, okay? 1986, legislative elections. Notice two large monolithic blocks. On the left, in rows, the center left, the Socialist Party of François Mitterrand, right? And on the right, the mighty Gaullists, right? Commanding a huge majority after that election, right? And then a tiny sliver of extreme left, the Communist Party, and an also tiny sliver on the extreme right of Jean-Marie Le Pen's National Front, right? This actually was the best that the National Front had done in the 1980s. They were often much smaller than that, right? A tiny little, almost inconsequential party. Now, the spectrum, as you will see, looks very different now. The Socialist Party here represented European integration. They represented a kind of long tradition of social democracy in France. They recruited the non-communist trade unions. They were, a tradition that went back really until the 1920s and 1930s. The Gaullists represented a conservative vision of the French Republic. Incarnated in the spirit of de Gaulle himself, a sovereigntist, grudgingly accepting European integration, but always insisting upon a strong French role. They rallied Catholic conservatives as well. And these two monolithic blocks, I'm simplifying things a little bit. Right? Occasionally there were groups that appeared in the center, but I feel justified in leaving them out because they were usually vehicles for the presidential ambitions of individual politicians, and they rapidly got absorbed in one or the other side here. So this monolithic block, center left, center right, seemed to characterize French politics. Can we wait till the end?
What's the yellow dot?
The yellow dots, these are just sort of some of the smaller independent centrist parties. There was the UDF, which did get bigger every once in a while. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing was from a centrist party in the 1970s. There were a few others, right? But basically it was an up. And this generally held through the end of the 20th century, right? But it was challenged most vociferously by Le Pen's National Front. And I want to just say a little bit about him. He's the father of Marine Le Pen, who is currently the head of the National Rally, which is the heir to this political party. Jean-Marie Le Pen, his political career goes back to the 1950s. He served in the French military in the French-Algerian War. He is a pugnacious provocateur, an anti-Semite, an open racist, kind of gleefully puncturing the sort of rules of public debate throughout his career. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of who he was, he had a habit, for example, of suing people for libel when they accused him, say, of participating in torture in the French-Algerian War, and losing because there was evidence. In fact, he had mentioned it himself in his own publications earlier in his career. So you can get a sense of the kind of person he was. He was at one point tried for apology for crimes against humanity, that is sort of defending crimes against humanity, by claiming that the Holocaust was a simple detail of history. And this is the sort of thing. His party rallied together a wide range of people who were disaffected with the French Republic, including dead-enders from the colonial settler population who were angry at Charles de Gaulle for negotiating Algerian independence. Also kind of retrograde survivors from the Vichy regime that had collaborated with the Germans during the Second World War, and then a younger generation of rightists politicized in 1968 against the left, who began to rally to him as he adopted anti-immigration as the main platform in the 1980s, right? Now, his high point came in 2002 when he defeated the socialist candidate in the first round and went into the second round of the presidential election, and he got 17.8 in the first round, and then basically the same score in the second round. Jacques Chirac was elected with 82% of the vote. But that was the high point. To make it into the second round of the presidential elections was an enormous achievement for him and his party, and shocking to people who understood the nature of his politics, right? This is him from the 2007 presidential election. The mainstream parties had always had a kind of curious relationship with Le Pen and his party. The socialists were happy to see him there because he provided the Socialist Party with a kind of boogeyman on the right that they could use to mobilize their own voters. And François Mitterrand famously changed the rules for proportional representation in the mid-'80s in order to give his party a boost. And that's actually what produced those seats that were on that last picture I showed you. Meanwhile, the center-right party, the Gaullist tradition, was always tempted during the electoral cycles to mimic the kind of aggressive, xenophobic, and anti-immigrant line in order to try and steal some of those votes for itself. So much so that when Nicolas Sarkozy ran in 2007, the left put up posters like, if you want to vote for Le Pen, vote for, if you're going to vote for Sarkozy, you might as well vote for Le Pen, saying he's effectively the same. And I should add here, Sarkozy was not Le Pen. He represented a different political tradition, but he was very willing to use a kind of inflammatory rhetoric, particularly on issues of integration, on religious minorities, on Islam, in order to rally support from that conservative side of the, and it worked. He was elected in 2007 president. He served as president until 2012, right? So throughout the first couple decades of this century, those two monolithic blocs, the Gaullists on the right, on the center right, and the socialists on the center left, have been progressively weakened now to the point of near irrelevance. And as they weakened, a gap opened up in the center. And this is what Emmanuel Macron perceived in 2017 when he ran for president, trying to create a kind of citizens movement, as he called it, in the center. He was from the Socialist Party, but he'd only been a member for a couple of years. He had a technocratic experience as a banker, and he carved out support for a citizens movement in the aftermath of a number of very rough years in France, right? The terrorist attacks of 2012 and 2015 had really sharpened the divisions. The traditional parties, the center-right and the center-left, seemed inadequate to meet the crisis, and he managed to capitalize on disaffection to carve out a space in the center, which he did. And in his first legislative elections in 2017, got an overwhelming majority, all right? Ideologically, it was less clear what he had. He zigzagged back and forth between positions that mimicked the center left and mimicked the center right. But after a while, it became clear that he preferred to be a little bit over on the center right side, mostly because he, I think, and I haven't spoken to him, but I think what he calculated was that the left had no choice but to support him, right? If the extreme right-wing candidate runs, the left has to continue to support Macron. And Macron thought that he could mimic some of that conservative language in order to maintain his right flank in the maintenance of his majority. In 2022, however, after the pandemic, Macron lost his majority. So this is 2022 legislative elections. There are 577 seats in the parliament. You need 289 to have a majority and get anything done easily in the parliament. And he ended up in 2022 with only 245. The left was a kind of coalition between an extreme left group, which I'll talk about in a minute, the socialists. The Republican Gaullists were reduced to this small sliver here, and notice the National Rally, the heir to the National Front, got 89 seats in 2022. That's enormous. Up until 2012, they had as little as 2 seats. In 2017, they had 8. And suddenly in 2022, they have 89. So you can see the rapidity of the growth on the extreme right under Marine Le Pen, the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, who inherited the party in 2011. And she has followed a very clever policy, I mean, smart, tactically, of maintaining the base, keeping a very strong nationalist line, arguing very much for what they call national preference and a reduction of immigration, campaigning heavily on security, but at the same time she did something her father would never do, which is she embraced the Republic. Jean-Marie Le Pen was in some ways an anti-Republican. He had inherited the hatred of the Republic that goes back in French history to the Dreyfus affair, right? It goes that the extreme right of the Vichy regime, the same people who collaborated with the Germans during the Second World War. She embraced, in particular, the secular values of the Republic because that allowed her, A, to win votes in the center, but also to use the ideology of the secular republic against religious minorities who she felt were changing French culture and French society, right? That was a very important part. She continues to say many of the same things, and the other thing she did was she kicked all the old anti-Semites who were friends with her father out of the party. She sort of reduced them out. And she does not accept that. She has now even actually been accepted and marched recently in protests against anti-Semitism. And that's a big change from the previous party, her ability to do that. Okay. On the left, as the Socialist Party collapsed, and here it's complicated, we can talk about it in the Q&A. It has a lot to do with the way that the Socialist Party, during the process of European integration, was forced to adopt and defend more austere policies of state spending as a result of European integration, and that and to embrace things like pension reforms and things like that were controversial, and that caused them to lose some support on the left. And that opened up the possibility for this person to create a kind of insurgent position on the left. Jean-Luc Mélenchon came from the Socialist Party, became disaffected with it, and has now been at the head of a kind of push on the far left, which has incorporated what's left of the old Communist Party with a number of other disaffected leftist organizations that didn't want to cooperate with the socialists anymore. It now goes under the name of La France Insoumise. They've had several other names over the last decade. And you can get a sense here of their progression, right? Emerged after 2009, 6.5% of the vote. He came in third in the presidential election in 2017 with 22% of the vote. And then in 2022, in the elections that I showed you there, Mélenchon and La France Insoumise actually made a coalition with the socialists, a moment that many people on the left had hoped that they would be able to resolve their differences. And they got 32% of the vote, but then soon after the terrible attacks on October 7th, the Hamas attacks on Israel, the Socialist Party broke with Mélenchon because he refused to condemn Hamas as a terrorist organization, and that created a split once more on the left. So that sets the stage here for what happened this summer. The European parliamentary elections happened in June. Am I taking too much time? No, it's okay. I'll go quickly. The European elections happened in June, and the Rassemblement National, the national rally under Marine Le Pen, the extreme right party, came in first with 31% of the vote. This was a stunner. Something like this had never happened. Remember, this is a party that only had 2 seats in parliament 10 years before, right, out of 577. And now this party had almost a third of the vote. Macron's coalition, in light blue there, was humiliated with about half of what Marine Le Pen's party had gotten. The Socialist Party, also about 14%. La France Insoumise with Mélenchon, about 9%. And the great, mighty Gaullist tradition, the Republicans, are at 7.2% here. I mean, it's kind of a stunning collapse if you remember that picture I showed you from 1986, right? So this is where Macron, already hobbled by a difficult situation where he doesn't have a full majority and he has to cobble together a majority for any measure he wants to pass, looked at that situation and surprised everybody this summer by calling for a snap election, dissolving parliament and calling an immediate election. And I didn't understand it myself when I saw it. It was so stunning. The next presidential election is in 2027. Macron is term limited. He can't run again himself. The most he can do is handpick a successor and help them win. So why would he dissolve parliament at a moment when his opponent is so clearly dominating electoral politics? Why would he dissolve parliament at that moment in order, and therefore sort of hobble any chances of getting anything done before he leaves office in 2027? Some people even went so far as to think that Macron, out of desperation, was actually inviting the voters to give some power to the extreme right, and that they would therefore have a stake in the status quo and be held responsible for the kind of difficult decision-making that you do in government, and so that they couldn't run purely as a kind of opposition with a sort of virgin slate. I don't know if that's true, but if that was his logic, it totally failed. Because when they had the legislative election at the end of the month, sort of the worst possible solution from Macron's perspective happened. In the first round, the same thing that happened in the European elections happened. Marine Le Pen's national rally got basically the same vote, about 31% of the vote, more votes than any other party. But in the horse trading that followed between the first round and the second round, and I don't know if you understood, Geneviève explained this a little bit. What happens is, when you go from the first round and the second round, there's 577 seats. That's 577 districts. Every party runs a list in every district. And in each district, if you get more than 50% of the vote, you win outright. You go straight to parliament, right? But if nobody gets 50% of the vote, they look closely at the results. And everybody who gets more than 12.5% of registered voters advances to the second round. And in this case, there were 300 such districts that went to the second round. And I think, was it 197 of them were three-way races. And this is where the arbitrage possibilities come into it. A third place candidate can bow out in favor of a second place candidate when their combined votes will beat the first place candidate, right? And so what happened was the opponents of the National Front made these deals all over the place. So even though the National Front got more votes than anybody else in the first round, they did not get the most seats. Instead, we got a parliament that looked like this, with the most votes actually going to the left this time. The new Popular Front, as it is called in this cycle, which combines some of the socialists with Mélenchon's movement. The centrists still don't have their majority. They needed 289, and they got 163. And the National Rally came in third in number of seats, but it's still way more seats than they had before. They went from 89 to 143 if you include some of their allies. That's extraordinary victory for her. And now we are in a situation where Macron had to look at this composition of parliament and say, how am I going to make a majority here? And he tried to negotiate with members of the left in order to make a coalition that would include at least most of those red dots and the yellow dots, and maybe a portion of the blue dots as well. But the left refused to jettison aspects of its programs that would not be acceptable to the people, certainly in blue or at the right end of the yellow. And so Macron pulled his offers to their candidates, and he ended up giving the office of Prime Minister to Michel Barnier, who comes from that little blue wedge, one of the parties that lost seats in the election. So you can see the sort of fragile sense of legitimacy that has. Michel Barnier was I gotta stop, don't I? I do. Okay, I'm going to stop. I can see I've been talking for a long time. So that's the situation we're in now. Michel Barnier is prime minister. He's mostly known as the negotiator of Brexit for the EU. during the negotiations with Britain. He is not a strong, assertive personality. And the thing that I'll leave you with is this. The only reason that Michel Barnier did not lose a vote of censure the first week that the Parliament convened was because the 143 seats of the National Rally supported him. And that means moving forward from now on, Michel Barnier's government, working with Emmanuel Macron, can do nothing without the permission of the National Front. But at the same time, they're not in government. They have no ministers, so they're not responsible for anything that happens. He has the worst of all possible situations. She will certainly run, Marine Le Pen will certainly run in 2027. And I don't have a crystal ball. It is the best chance that she has ever had. The question is, can she get more than a third of the electorate? And that probably depends on a lot of other events that will happen between now and 2027. We don't know. But she is in a very good position. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Geneviève for the invitation and Gosha for taking care of logistics. I'm going to bring you instead straight into the present, into literally what happened in Italy in just this past month under Giorgia Meloni's government. But before, I want to also sort of zero in into the European elections, and I want to talk about one particular candidate that was elected, and that is Roberto Vannacci. So some newspaper headlines found that among the most surprising results of the European elections held in Italy in June 2024 was the victory of a seat by General Roberto Vannacci, an inexperienced candidate put forth by Ministry of Infrastructure Matteo Salvini for his own far-right party, League, rebranded as Lega Salvini Premier. But one might wonder if Vannacci's victory was indeed a surprise. I would instead propose that it was to be expected, considering that 28.75% of the voters, or 29%, reconfirmed their confidence in Giorgia Meloni's far-right party, Fratelli d'Italia, or Brothers of Italy, who came to power 2 years ago with 26% of the vote. And just sort of to echo some of the rapid ascension that Joshua had talked about in regards with Le Pen and the National Front and the National Rally, just 9 years before Meloni won, so in 2013, Fratelli d'Italia, or Brothers of Italy, basically garnered about 1.9% of the vote. So from 2013 to 2022, Giorgia Meloni and her party, Brothers of Italy, became the majority party in Italy. So again, very quick ascension to power here. But who is Roberto Vannacci? And why did his election spark so much sensation in a country that is already governed by a far-right party, which is Brothers of Italy? In these brief remarks, I would like to trace the rise to popularity of Vannacci and how his successes are very much tied to the climate that the Meloni's government has cultivated in Italy in these past few years, especially the discourse of what I call the "one cannot say anything anymore," and the victimization that accompanies it. So on August 10th, 2023, General Roberto Vannacci self-published his book, Il Mondo al Contrario, roughly translatable in English, The Upside Down World. This is August in Italy. People are at the beach, Ferragosto is nearing, and Italians' attention is elsewhere. However, Vannacci's book became an immediate bestseller, becoming the 5th most sold book in Italy in 2023. By 2024, Vannacci's book had sold more than 200,000 copies, and it had been republished by the small editorial house Il Cerchio. Vannacci, in this book, lays out a sort of manifesto of reactionary and conservative politics. 12 chapters guide us through a relentless attack on what he calls the, quote, rights of minorities, which he understands as a, quote, attack on normalcy. These minorities roughly include queer people, women, immigrant, second-generation Italians, transgender people. I've selected a quote here from Vannacci's book, which I think it is particularly relevant to illustrate a couple of key points about how the far right operates in Italy. And I'm going to read him here. I have my own idea of family. I believe that parental rights do not exist. What instead does exist is the right of children to be raised by those who create them biologically, and we cannot transcend this natural law. I absolutely disagree with surrogate motherhood, utero in affitto in Italian. In my opinion, it is a sort of childhood economy. Children cannot be bought, cannot be given. There cannot be trafficking of children, even if I do understand there is a desire to become parents. I cannot conceive of a woman used as an oven where a child is put and cooked and then is given to someone else. And here comes the important part of the quote that I would like for you to keep in mind as we move into these remarks. I do not want to impose my idea on anybody, but I want to have the freedom to express it. To give you some context, as of October 17, 2024, in Italy, what was then only a proposal signed by a Fratelli d'Italia Congresswoman, Carolina Varchi, surrogacy, already a crime, has become a universal crime, punishable across borders, comparable to the likes of genocide and pedophilia. And to make myself clear, when I mean surrogacy here, I mean all instances in which one may need to turn to this practice due to infertility or progress sicknesses, for example, when there is no financial compensation involved. Despite the legal shortcomings of this law, you cannot make something a universal crime if it is legal in other countries, especially other European Union countries. What I find disturbing and revealing of a larger trend within the far right in Italy is the defense of this law as a victory of feminism by both Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, whose running slogan was, I am a woman, a mother, an Italian, a Christian, and the Minister of the Family, Equal Opportunities and Natality, Eugenia Roccella, yet another woman, whose early political affiliations were with the most radical factions of the Italian pro-choice groups. And here I've selected two quotes from each of them about this. And up there is a quote instead from a Five-Star Movement congresswoman about this. So for Roccella, to make surrogacy a universal crime was the triumph of feminism, an example for the movement worldwide. While this is debatable, what I find relevant for the context of these initial remarks are two facts that through the discourse surrounding the criminality of surrogacy become obvious. First, that in order to grasp how the far right operates and reappropriates discourses that are not theirs, one has to accept that identity politics does not work. Meloni, while certainly a mother and a woman, has done nothing for mothers, more than a half of whom leave the workplace permanently after their first child because there isn't a robust enough infrastructure that allows them to reconcile their career and their family needs. And actually, Meloni took away even that little infrastructure that already existed before her coming into power. Nor did Meloni do anything for women who have witnessed an assault on their freedom to choose when Meloni allowed pro-life organizations to enter the public centers for women's reproductive health known as consultori. We should thus stop thinking that identities are somehow voting blocs that move in unison. That certainly became clear in this past election in this country. Second, we have to admit that the far right has mastered the culture wars, speaking of culture wars. And thus there is no point to try to fight on the level of cultural symbols and theoretical abstractions, because no matter what one might propose as a rational counterpoint to the beliefs they spout, their myths are just too powerful. Take, for example, Vannacci's comments on surrogacy. One might easily point out that surely what some may see surrogacy as an exploitation of a woman's reproductive apparatus, others might insist that a woman's uterus is hers and hers alone. And in fact, if we look at the quote again, Vannacci makes this about the trafficking of babies, thus playing on fears of sexual deviance and bourgeois depravity, and using the innocent children as the image here. Not that this is the only instance when children are invoked, especially in Italy. The same is true for other skirmishes within these culture wars. And I'm thinking here about the notion that children's morality is endangered by exposing them to queer and transgender people. And I want to return to Vannacci and his book, because my sense is that his ability to sell 200,000 copies in a market that does not read, okay, Italy's market in terms of like readership is very low compared to other European countries, has to do with specifically the last sentence of that quote, which is, I do not want to impose my idea on anybody, but I want to have the freedom to express it. The discourse of the one cannot say anything anymore allowed for the far right to reemerge in Italy through a figure like Meloni, who in turn allowed for pundits such as Vannacci to enter the public arena and not only to be accepted, but to be celebrated and elected to the European Parliament. One only needs to think about the fact that Matteo Salvini, who I mentioned earlier, another notorious politico of Italy's far right, failed to achieve the same electoral success that Meloni did. This despite the fact that the two share a very similar political project, a xenophobic, nationalist, white supremacist one. The difference is that Salvini did not master the rhetoric of victimization that seems to have animated much of the global far-right discourse in recent years. Indeed, he was far too unapologetic and crude in expressing his opinions of immigrants, and this is just the latest of a series of remarks by Salvini. This is, again, about October 19th, where he says, "Borders are sacred. One doesn't understand why, based on some judge's decision, dogs and pigs are allowed to arrive here in Italy." He comes across as a loud, callous brute, and thus, while his party has certainly been influential, it is no Fratelli d'Italia. By contrast, what Meloni and to a certain extent Vannacci have done has been to refract the same racist and homophobic assertions through the lenses of freedom of speech. Vannacci's words and what he came to represent embody the absurd notion that the real victims of modernity, or of at least the 21st century, are the Christian Italian mothers like Meloni and the heterosexual husbands like Vannacci. And to be clear, I'm not condemning here freedom of speech. Vannacci is, of course, free to write whatever he pleases, and Italians are obviously free to buy the books they want. What I'm suggesting is that Meloni and Vannacci have learned the rhetoric of victimization from the liberal establishment itself, which for years has framed its policies in terms of protecting identities and their rights. In other words, the far right took it upon itself to speak in the same terms as you would to oppress minorities to those who, while they may not have been a minority on paper, certainly felt excluded by the changing tides of Italian society. For example, studies show that the inclusion of what parties such as Lega and Fratelli d'Italia have called ideologia di gender, or gender ideology, in schools in Italy, prompted a set of educators who identified with those same traditional values that Meloni embraced as her slogan to feel marginalized and thus to oppose them. So what prompted the boycott of ideologia di gender had more to do with these educators feeling left out, that is, not equipped to teach these materials, than an actual hatred for the ideas about gender and sexualities discussed in these textbooks. Not that this is anything new. The far right has always played this game since its first appearance in Italy in the 1920s. It exploits the frustration, the disaffection, and the alienation of the working class and the middle class, reappropriating a leftist vocabulary to suit their own agenda. The promise is precisely that of a return to the past, however, a past that is somehow also imbued with progress and betterment. A past where one can say whatever they please because they are not policed or cancelled. A past where a woman's place is the domestic hearth. A past where Italians are white and only white. A past that has no room for young Italians who take their degrees and go elsewhere, who leave Italy in droves because there are no jobs for them, and if there are, the pay is a joke. The far-right rhetoric satisfies multiple constituencies and thus wins. Vannacci, with his book, reached enough Italians to secure a spot in the European Parliament, and along with him, there are 10 other Lega congressmen and congresswomen who joined a massive far-right coalition known as the Patriots, orchestrated by Orban's party, led by Jordan Bardella of the French National Rally, with Vannacci as his second in command. And this is the third largest voting bloc in the European Parliament right now. While some like to point out Meloni's centrist attitudes when it comes to Europe and NATO, after all, her party did not enter the Patriots coalition, stays out with the Conservatives, let's not forget that Fratelli d'Italia and Lega are much closer ideologically than what the media would have us believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Giulia. And now we have our presentation by Professor Greer.
Hi, I think I look about like I feel, so I'm going to go straight to the screen share.
Okay, because we don't see you at all, so.
Do you see Haven Hall, or the Art Museum now?
Yes. Okay,
Perfect.
good. Thank you, Scott.
So I want to thank you all for having me here, and I'm very grateful to the organizers and for the opportunity to speak. And I have the sneaking feeling I was positioned last in an effort to cheer you up. And I'm going to do my best, but that's not my natural take on what's going on in Britain right now, although it's certainly cheerier than what you see in a lot of other countries. Let me begin with an image that you probably will be glad to be behind. These are conservative governments since 2019. On the left, you see an immortal representation of Alexander de Pfeffel Boris Johnson, known to his friends as Al and to his voters as Boris, stuck on a zip line, which a number of newspapers right after Brexit correctly said was an iconic image of the current country. In the middle, you see Liz Truss. In a perfect representation of how British media works, The Economist said that it wasn't clear her government, having passed an unbelievably stupid semi-budget and cratered the country's bond rating, might not last longer than lettuce. So the Daily Star, a tabloid at the far other end of the spectrum of British media, set up a webcam on a picture of Truss and a lettuce. And the lettuce won. Truss's government lasted less time than it took for a supermarket lettuce to go bad. And on the right, you have the maladroit Rishi Sunak, an incredibly rich man through marriage, who was the last prime minister to inherit this sinking ship. And there's one of his many campaign misadventures, which is that he went to Wales right after they'd been kicked out of the European football competition and asked them if they were looking forward to the football, which England was playing in. This is three different forms of garish, populist incompetence, ideology, and putative technocracy in the form of Sunak, putative grown-ups. It was a pretty sad spectacle. And it's one of the things to bear in mind with British government is that because the MPs tend to be elected in waves, you get a talent pool, and if their government's been in office for a while, the talent pool starts to get awfully thin, and you go from the undeniable political talents of David Cameron to the dangerous political talents of Boris Johnson to the non-existent political talents of a Truss or a Sunak. It's kind of one of the cyclical things about British government is that they look very weak at the end because they simultaneously run out of ideas, mandate, and people. So what happened in the summer election, which Sunak called unusually early to great surprise? It seems to be a theme of this panel. Well, here's three maps of the results from the Financial Times. On the left, you have the geographic map, which, like any geographic constituency map, overrepresents empty places. And around the United Kingdom, different parties tend to sit for these empty places. So you see enormous orange Liberal Democrat seats up in northern Scotland, in the Highlands and Islands. You see a lot of really big conservative districts, say in southern Scotland and northeast England and Yorkshire, where nobody lives. But when you actually look at the seats and do each seat as a box, you see the middle picture of the country, which, as you see, is an enormous orange spectacle with decorations of red and orange, of blue and orange. The blue is the conservative seats, half is of the last election. The red is Labour seats. Turquoise is Reform, we'll get back to them. And orange is the Liberal Democrat Party, which is a largely, which is a centrist party that benefits from strategic voting. And on the right, you have the changes. So each one of those is boxes that has a color in it, is a party that has changed from one party. So what it shows you is a lot of Labor pickups and a lot of Liberal Democratic pickups. Now, what does this all show us? First of all, as the middle and the right pictures show, it was a great night for Labor. Labor quite predictably demolished the incumbent government, and it is now by far the largest party and is able to govern alone. And the UK doesn't have a really strong and effective tradition of coalition. Governments like to govern alone and be held accountable. The Liberal Democrats also had a good evening. This is due to what we call strategic voting, because British voters, particularly English voters, are very practiced in figuring out which party is likeliest to defeat the party they hate most. So in the south and southwest of England, there's a lot of places where the Labour candidate got essentially no votes because the Conservative candidate could be defeated best by the Lib Dem. You find a few other places where the reverse happened, and the Lib Dems essentially didn't contest the seat in order to hand it to Labour. So all that orange, there's a few areas, as you can see, of kind of traditional Liberal Democrat strength, and that's been culturally baked in for a long time, but there's not many. The Lib Dems, by and large, win when you have upper middle class, higher education seats with a lot of people who detest the Conservatives but would rather not vote for Labour. Then you have the SNP in Scotland. You see a few little yellow dots there. This is an epical destruction. The SNP basically was the party of Scotland for getting on 20 years. And now it's in deep, deep trouble. So Scottish nationalism, which you might have expected would receive a boost from Brexit, actually was pretty much sent into an existential crisis. I don't really know how the SNP, the Scottish National Party, is going to emerge. I personally love to talk about Northern Ireland and Wales. I've written 2 books about them, but I'm going to skip over them because you have to be intrinsically interested in the places. This is, so far, I think, the cheerful story that I'm supposed to give of a country booting out a populist radical right set of clowns and replacing them with somebody who at least has a minimal commitment to stable electoral democracy. But let's head over to the actual votes and seats. The bar chart on the left is the number of MPs you get. The first thing you'll notice is that this is wildly disproportionate, right? This was a very, very efficient electoral coalition for Labour and the Liberal Democrats, which you can see on the right. Labour got 411 seats on half as many, again, votes as the Conservatives, who got only 121. The Lib Dems got a little more than half the votes of the Conservatives and more than half of the seats. So you're seeing that the distribution of voters and the tactical voting explains a lot of this Labour majority. Now, as you look down the right column, you notice 2 anomalies which might mean something. One of them is the very large Reform contingent. There's only 5 Reform MPs, but Reform is the inheritor of the United Kingdom Independence Party. It is the new model, far-right political party of the kind that we've been talking about for this entire panel. It's blazingly xenophobic, it's nationalistic, its godfather, leader, owner, Nigel Farage, is right now palling around with Donald Trump, and they're having to put down rumors that he's going to be Keir Starmer's ambassador because Trump would like that. And they got 4 million votes. They got more votes than the Liberal Democrats, and you'll notice the Lib Dems got 72 MPs while the Reform Party got only 3.5 million. What happened here is that there are hundreds of seats in which the Conservative MP plus the Reform vote were greater than the Labour MP's vote. So there's a very, very deep instability here, right? You have a lot of Labour seats and a lot of Lib Dem seats and very few Reform and Conservative seats, but that's on the basis of the Conservatives losing vote to the Reform Party. The next unusually large group of votes that you see down there is 1.9 million votes for the Greens, who got a whopping 4 parliamentary seats. The problem is Green votes have a strong tendency to be protest votes against Labour in safe Labour seats. So it's very easy to see how, if the Conservatives, for example, continue to decline, you could see a Reform surge that actually turns into a lot of seats in this electoral system. It's much harder to see how the Greens would, because people vote for the Greens when they have the luxury of knowing it won't damage their Labour MP. So you have very little potential for a green shift, but you have a very big instability in the extent to which the Labour and the Lib Dem seats often depend on the right-wing vote splitting between the Conservatives and the populist radical right Reform Party. So, what is this going to mean? I hope I've cheered you all up. The reason I'm using Financial Times graphics is partly that I like the Financial Times, but also because the picture on the right there has been deservedly making the rounds. It's showing that for the first time since 1945, we have yet to see, in the biggest year of elections in human history, we have yet to see an incumbent party not lose vote share. The red dot happens to be the Democrats in the United States, which I hope casts some light on the current Democratic fratricide. A couple of dots down, you see what happened to the Conservatives. They're the sort of minus 13, minus 14-ish. Political scientists would say this isn't all that interesting. Inflation is absolutely devastating to incumbent governments. Within that context, which is overwhelmingly what matters, nativist parties of various sorts are outperforming due to the strength of anti-immigration backlash. Not saying that immigration necessarily causes backlash, but you can certainly effectively foment big backlashes, as I think we've been discussing. And it's also, I say nativism, because there's interesting changes. For example, Chega, which is the Portuguese party, is extremely in favor of immigrants from Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Brazil, but they really hate Muslims. So that's not racism, that's a different form of Lusophone nativism. Labor's seat totals are partly, I said delicately, I should probably have said substantially, explained by many, many seats in which Labour votes are greater than Conservative votes, but less than Reform plus Conservative, which is why the Conservative Party's leadership contest is substantially a question of how do we get Reform voters back. Now, Labour's had a while to be in office, and they're doing a script. It's kind of a mashup of the script that was successful for David Cameron, and the script was successful for Tony Blair almost 30 years ago. The Blair script is that before the election, you say as little as possible and keep as close to the incumbent government in order to reassure voters, and only pick a fight with the incumbent government when you know you'll win. Both for Blair and for Starmer, this meant saying that you're going to keep the government's spending plans. The spending plans of the exiting governments were absolute nonsense in many different ways, from being bad public policy to the math fundamentally not adding up. The Cameron template then was to, having done that, try and make a lot of big changes in the initial parliament, whereas the Blair one was to hold your majority, as somebody said, like a Fabergé egg. It looks a lot like what Starmer's trying to do is the Cameron template of do one really big thing, which is activate private sector investment and public sector investment, because the UK is, like a lot of Europe, suffering not just from inflation, but also from really profound underinvestment in the public and private sectors, and that explains a lot of Europe's malaise. I personally love to talk about Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, or the extreme difficulties that a post-Trump, post-Brexit British polity faces, but I think those are things that we might want to discuss in Q&A, and if I were in the audience, I think I'd much rather be talking about France and Italy, because those talks were fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have about 20 minutes. I don't know if you guys want to respond to each other or we just bring it to the floor. So we have 2 microphones at the front of the room. If you are unwilling to go to the microphone there, you can raise your hand and we'll bring one to you. There's a question here.
Hello. Hi, Professor Cole. I'm a student in your history class. Yes, I'm Patrick. Yes, nice to meet you. The important part is that I'm your student. I just wanted to know that I was representing you here. So when you talked about the rise of the right wing in France, particularly in this past election, you made a passing mention about October 7th. And I wanted to ask you, in a similar way that in the United States, post-October 7th, a lot of conservatives and maybe a lot of liberal elites found themselves coalescing around Trump in a post-October 7th world. That, to me, contributed, it felt like it contributed to a lot of the popular support that we saw last Tuesday. What do you think the effect of October 7th has been for the extreme right in France? Have you found a similar alliance being made between elites like, Bill Ackman and Donald Trump, or there were a couple other prominent elites who, after October 7th, said that we're going to get behind Trump because he seems like the strong Israeli candidate. What sort of effect did that have on French electoral politics? Because you mentioned in passing, and I just wanted to hear about it a little more specifically. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick, for that question. So the question about the way in which the events after October 7th resonated in France is complicated, because in fact the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been resonating in France for a very long time. And in a strange way, the story of French colonialism also resonates in Israel and among Palestinians. Because the story of the French in Algeria in the 20th century is a story about a revolutionary movement that made the settlers leave, right? French Algerian independence ended up with the French settlers, the settler population, which was about 10% of the population in Algeria, leaving. And that story haunts the imaginations of people in Israel and Palestine, right? And the population of France has a significant Jewish population, tiny in comparison to the majority. I think the Jewish population in France is less than 1% of the population. Depending on how you count who is Jewish, it's somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000 people in a country of 65 million. The population of Muslim heritage or practicing Muslims in France is also hard to calculate and is often exaggerated. Jean-Marie Le Pen was sort of frequently say there are 20 million Muslims in France or more. You hear numbers like that. That's ridiculous. There are about 65 million people in France today. The Muslim population is probably about 3 million people. So, and I think the best way to think about the resonance of events in the Middle East with events in France is to remember that the populations in France who are connected to this long history of the Middle East or in North Africa have evolved in their conceptions together over a long time. And in that evolution, there is the experience of colonialism, right? There were Jews in Algeria, there were Muslims in Algeria. They had a relationship with each other before the French arrived. And then colonialism changed that relationship. And the end of colonialism changed it again. So I'm summarizing this complexity because I want you to understand that there are no simple answers to the way that people take sides after an event like October 7th. Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in Algeria evolved together. Prejudice against Muslims and prejudice against Jews were connected to the experience of colonialism. And the way in which those fears, hatreds, and bitternesses resonate today takes place against this complicated background in which Jews and Muslims share a common heritage often. 40% of the Jews in France today think of themselves as Sephardic Jews, which means they trace their heritage back to families that once lived as a minority in a Muslim society, right? And so you can see the complexity here. That said, and I can talk about that forever because I wrote a book on that, but I'm going to stop talking about that complexity at that level. And now I'm going to just say that the way that October 7th resonated with the elections was largely in the way that it divided the left and made it very hard for a coalition to appear here that would. They did actually do it. I mean, the NUP was the coalition that was formed for the 22 legislative elections. It fell apart after October 7th, but then was reestablished in the face of the European elections this summer with the new Popular Front. It's a, I could go on, but I just wanted to say that there is clearly an important difference between the ways in which Marine Le Pen's leadership of the party has changed the extreme right with regard to anti-Semitism. She has rallied to the Republic in an important way. That's a very significant difference. Her father was a notorious anti-Semite. He enjoyed provoking people with anti-Semitic statements in the 1970s and 1980s. She does not do that. And this has been part of the way in which she has sought to divide the left over the presence of Muslim minorities in France. Yeah.
If I may, before we get to other questions, we're taking a cue, so we have several. But I want to say, in response to October 7th, what you have seen in France too is the rise, frantic rise of anti-Semitic violence in France, right? Numbers like tripling, and violent. So people getting beaten up or attacked, and Jewish sites vandalized. And I think that this really upset people, not only Jews, but people...
Thank you. I should have mentioned this. Yeah, thank you.
People on the left. And I think that what Professor Cole said about the fact that Marine Le Pen, disavowed anti-Semitism on the one hand, but she also marched in a march against anti-Semitism, which made people in the regular right, the center, and part of the left trust her on that issue, a bit like for Trump. So there is, I think, something that they have seen her as really like wanting to stall immigration from North Africa and from Muslim countries, and as defending. So, and given the threat against Jewish persons and institutions, it might be that people who were already kind of leaning right wouldn't mind going that far right after that. I don't know if you agree, but that's...
I can't surmise sort of the logic that people, I don't know if but it's clear that people who had not voted for the National Front before are now willing to vote for the National Rally under Marine Le Pen.
And there was also another party just before around, what's his name, the TV host who's Jewish. Algerian.
Eric Zemmour.
Eric Zemmour. So she also kind of gained some of the people who would never vote for her and were supportive of Zemmour, then defected back to her after that because they had gone far right, and then he was out of the picture and then could actually support her.
Right.
I think Scott wanted to say something.
Scott, you want to say something?
Yes. Can I also say something that picks up a minor thread in the initial question, which is the way October 7th didn't just change a lot of ordinary people's thinking, but it also changed the political behavior of billionaires. And I think one of the things we want to stress is that voters are unhappy in all three countries for a lot of reasons, often to do with inflation and austerity. But the supply side of politics, the media channeling your excitement, telling you who to blame, has seen a tremendous oligarchization over about the last 20 years, which goes with the increasing income inequality in Western countries. So France, the UK, the United States, a lot of the platforms and a lot of the legacy publications are in the hands of very rich people who are unabashedly affiliated with the right. So the phenomenon of Elon Musk and Rupert Murdoch, they can be iterated among people who are less popular. And I think part of the hard push to the right as well as the importance of things of what an individual billionaire thinks about October 7th, is because we have political systems that are increasingly wired to respond to billionaires.
Can I quick respond to that too? I want to say I've just been reading a book by Vincent Tiberge, who makes this argument. He says that the rightward turn in France is a reality at the level of the media world, but it's not necessarily as deep among the electorate. And he actually cites anti-Semitism as an example. He's a specialist in public opinion polls. And if you look at the long history of anti-Semitism in France, say from 1945, right, when there was still enormous latent anti-Semitism in France, up until the present, the story is actually one of mostly progress, right? And I don't want to deny the violence recently at all, but that the media has one representation of events, and often events that occur that are, well, I'm not going to go. I think anyway. It's an interesting book. It's called La droitisation. I can't remember. It's something about like the rightward turn would be the translation. Vincent Tiberge, Tiberj. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your, can you hear me? Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk. Politics is not my field, but I am a German studies scholar. And I think many of these trends are very similar in Germany with nuances because it has a different parliamentary system. But I have sort of a different question, and that is last year when Wolfgang Schäuble died, the longtime German finance minister, Emmanuel Macron traveled to Berlin and held a speech in his honor at the Bundestag, all in German. And it was an astonishing moment for Germans. I think even some Bundestagsabgeordnete cried at the moment. And I listened to the speech. It was really an amazing moment in the relationship between Germany and France. And my question is as these shifts to the right in the dominance of these parties in the parliamentary systems, how do you foresee the changes in the relationships between France, Germany, and Italy, for instance?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I can answer from what I see Meloni doing currently in the European Union. As I said at the end of my remarks, oftentimes we hear this sort of way of describing Meloni's policies as, well, she's, she keeps her right, her far right at home in Italy, but when it comes to NATO and Europe, she is much more of a centrist. And, we've seen this summer her emerging, as the host of G7 in southern Italy. And, yet again, she switched her position when it came to the Ukraine-Russia question. And so I think that what I can imagine is that Meloni, because she didn't choose to have the Brothers of Italy enter the Patriots coalition, is going to play the game insofar that she is going to push for more conservative policies, but she's not going to, let's say, at least this is my, my prediction, she's not going to completely kick out all the legal documents that are in Italy, right? But what she's going to do, which has already been done and which was sanctioned by the European Union, is that she's going to create centers alongside the Mediterranean, not in Italy, where she's going to put those immigrants that arrive in Italy back into those centers, right? And that was sanctioned. Like the European Union thought that that was an excellent plan to pay Albania to create immigration center there for immigrants arriving on the coasts of Italy, right? And I think that this is probably where we will see that, the sort of triangulation between France, Germany, and Italy is always often about immigrants coming in through Italy. So that would be my answer.
So I'll just say briefly, Franco-German cooperation has a long history. I don't think Marine Le Pen will give a speech in German in Germany. But I don't think she will pull out of the European Union. either. She did make some. Her party has traditionally been very anti-European. I mean, going back to her father. But after watching the debacle of Brexit, Marine Le Pen stopped making any noise about that, and she's talking about reform from within. Certainly, there is concern about the Schengen Accords and the free movement of peoples. That's going to be an issue. But I don't think she's going to do, if she were elected president, for example, I would be surprised if she embarked on a kind of direct confrontation with Europe. The one thing that makes me a little nervous is also a long connection between Marine Le Pen's party and Putin, which is, I think, mostly for most people, it's under the radar. There was a question about funding, and how much money they got was never clear. But she is clearly within the orbit of a different set of references, and so that makes predicting the future unpredictable and a little nerve-wracking. And I'll just say one thing, too, about the far right and the European Parliament. At least in France, European parliamentary elections have often been seen as more remote and less important, lower stakes. And that means that they're also a moment when it's kind of a cheap opportunity to give a protest vote. And so weirdly, some of the parties that benefited from European parliamentary elections were anti-European right-wing parties who, as the recipients of protest votes, got more representation than they might have in parliamentary elections. And what's changed now is that Marine Le Pen got 30%, more than 30% in the European elections in June, and then reproduced that charge, or those votes in the legislative elections, which means it's not just a protest vote anymore. It's clear that she has anchored herself on the right.
So, hi. With the issue of October 7th and the current war in Palestine or Israel, there's, at least in the United States, a trend where, surprisingly, there was a lot of talk of Arab Americans or Muslim Americans voting for Jill Stein, but surprisingly, Dearborn, the only city where we can say for certain that it has a Muslim Arab majority, came out and voted for Trump, which was quite surprising because you would expect Jill Stein, but maybe not Trump. And I've noticed in the US there's this increasingly weird trend in the last 4 to 5 years where left-wing minority groups, maybe usually those with traditional values, but not always, such as Hispanics even, and right-wing groups find common cause on certain issues. Like, for example, how Trump came out and he was very strong in support of Israel early on, but now he's coming out and saying that Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley, two valid neocons who traditionally support the state of Israel, are no longer going to be in his administration. And he seems, from the reactions of the Egyptian president and the Turkish president, to be making certain overtures against the state of Israel. Do you think that this is an isolated trend to the United States or a temporal trend, or it's something that you're going to see more and more in Europe, where certain right-wing elements that may suspect that Israel's interfering in their government or has some undue influence within their societies, and Muslims who dislike the neoconservative foreign policies that the Israelis have been advocating, or certain other groups that for various reasons have historically voted left-wing but now are inching closer to right wing? Do you think you're going to see some more of that mixing of ideological orthodoxies going forward, or is that just a fluke for the present day?
I can say something about Britain. So I should have called it out, but when I was showing vote and seat totals, way down at the bottom, there was a little gray bar with 8 seats. And that's other. And most of those other seats are safe labor seats in predominantly South Asian. There's not a lot of non-South Asian Muslims living in the United Kingdom that had defeated Labor MPs on a overwhelmingly opposed to Israel's actions in Gaza, Lebanon, etc. since October 7th platform. But when you look at these guys, and there has been a history of them as kind of independent, typically renegade labor MPs running primarily on opposition to Israeli activities, they are really, really, really kind of a very socially conservative old left. And you can see exactly how this combines a very socially conservative, relatively recent immigrant community with a lot of small businesses activity and so forth, that's boiling mad about what's going on in the Middle East and is not sensing that Keir Starmer or any other major political party is going to deliver for them, and which is therefore very attentive to a sort of tailored message that whose main victim is actually, in this case, the Labour Party, which likes to say that it's going to pick up the internationalist and the people of color's votes because the Tories are simply such a white party. So, costs Labour 8 seats, but it represents a subtext that is increasingly important in the heavily migrant cities, particularly of the north.
I just also want to follow up, and I think that my answer to your final question, which is like moving forward, are we going to sort of continuously see a mashup of ideologies? Yes, the answer is yes, because as I tried to explain in my remarks, like identities are not voting blocks that are always going to vote that way, you know, but also at the same time, you know, if you look closely at the US elections, if you look closely at states that have Trump has won largely, what you're also going to notice is that other questions on the ballots that one might see as progressive questions, a $15 minimum wage, one with like large margin in Missouri, Nebraska, we have paid medical leave also, one with like by 80%. So you see, these are the dissonances that you're talking about and that we're seeing. And so I think that I think that it's from there that we need to start thinking about what this future mashup might look like. And also to just sort of give a moment of background to Meloni and to the European election as well. The PD, which is Italy's left party, the Democratic Party, won about 22% of the vote, which actually gained from 2022. So I guess I just wanted to give a sliver of optimism there in the sense that they performed a little bit better. And Italy also has the Five Star Movement, which was a populist party that emerged precisely in 2013, where Meloni only had the 1.9%, and it emerged in order to break these two blocks that were very much similar to the one Professor Cole described in terms of like having a left Democratic Party, right? And you know, if your family all voted that, you always are going to vote that, right? And then you had Berlusconi, Forza Italia. And so the Five Star Movement emerged in order to break that tie. And then the Five Star Movement then has become a sort of a jolly in terms of like where it is going to be placed as well. But I think that also the Five Star Movement is a good example of that ideological mashup that you were asking about. So.
Hello, is it? Yeah, perfect. Okay. I was just here to ask, kind of in for both Italy and France, although it kind of focuses more on France, just because of the kind of context and how involved they are with this. I was just kind of discussing, like, with the invasion of the Ukraine, many EU leaders have called and passed legislative bills to support Ukraine's defenses against Ukraine or against Russia through public speeches or of unwavering support and the supply of both humanitarian and military aid. They kind of are both, they make up a good chunk of Ukraine's defenses and defensive and offensive capabilities at this time. Given kind of the right-wing leaders, namely Orban of Europe, who is very heavily, I would not say in favor of Putin, but definitely favors his image and as vocally has spoken out in some almost praising him for being such a masculine figure of conservative ideals that challenges Western progressivism. And then you also have Trump in the U.S., who's taking more of an approach of isolationism, at least in my view, where they are trying to get the U.S. out of the war in some way here and there to, I guess, support the taxpayers by not making their money go to war across the seas, as he puts it. This will be done, at least in his view, by ending the war through negotiations, whether in Ukraine's favor or Russia's favor, and most likely Russia's, given how he's spoken about it in the past. I was just wondering, given both France's involvement in supplying Ukraine's a good chunk of their offensive capabilities, mainly I think the AMX armored cars and the Caesar 155 millimeter cannons that have been widely used both in the Kursk offensives and in previous offensives throughout Ukraine. Do the right-wing parties of France and I guess in some ways Italy support the continued involvement of their nations, or are they more willing to see a negotiation and end the conflict as soon as possible?
Well, I think that's the question right now, right? Because if Harris had won, it would be different. Because now European leaders that have been supportive of Ukraine have to either say, okay, we're going to pick it up, or are we going to basically go along the US way? And the likely scenario is that Trump will pressure Ukraine to cede territories and end the war. So Macron, was extremely vocal in support of Ukraine and has committed, at one point he even mentioned that Europe should send soldiers, to Ukraine. So he's extremely pro-Ukraine, but I think that this might change because there's going to be a realignment, basically, and with significant resources that are going to stop from the U.S. I think that Poland is extremely supportive and is sending a lot of, contributing a great deal for the war effort. And France and, Germany, we're going to see where they align. But, their help won't go as far without the U.S. So then there's going to have to be a calculation as to, is it worth investing so much if it's not going to make a difference? So I think that we're going to know relatively soon what's going to happen. I don't know, what's your take on this?
I agree. I think somebody like Marine Le Pen has been very careful on any foreign policy statements. I would be surprised if she had as strong a support as Macron has given, but she has not said, she doesn't talk as much about him. She's really focused on this domestic political scene, which she has mastered, and she doesn't want to do anything to threaten her chances in 2027. But I think, I'm afraid actually the war might be over by 2027 if we're headed the way we're going, right? Yeah.
So one last question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a great talk. My name is Martin Diocos from Slovakia. I'm here at Weiser Center, a research fellow, and I'm quite concerned about Central Europe as well. I prefer to call it Central Europe. Let's call it like maybe eastern border of the European Union, because now we may see that in Slovakia there was a political coalition like pro-Russian, I would say populist coalition that won last September. And they've been doing terrible things, in my opinion, like Prime Minister going to Russia One, talking about how we need to stop the war in Ukraine, and he supports Russia. Then he went to China, for example, for his round trip to establish the strategic partnership with China. We have Orban in Hungary. We also are probably going to have Andrej Babiš in the Czech Republic, because he gained a lot of support, which is also quite dangerous for me, in my opinion. And now I keep wondering, like, what does this mean for Ukraine if this, and FPO in Austria as well, talking about Central Europe. So we have this rising wave of populism, and I would say even pro-Russian populism. And where does this take us later on? Because if Putin gets Ukraine, and you said that Marine Le Pen has this relationship with him. If he takes Ukraine, what stops him from taking Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, Bulgaria later on, Poland? Poland is my only hope. But is Poland enough? I mean, in this case, to defend Europe?
No, but Poland and the Baltic states are first in line before, okay. There's if he were to take Ukraine, yes, there's a border with Slovakia.
Yeah,
So
but still,
Poland
I
is
mean,
strong.
Poland is building the strongest army now in Europe, right? Because they've been investing significantly in that capability to defend. But he's like this information war that's been, and he's been very successful in Slovakia and Hungary and Bulgaria. So probably
Serbia.
maybe Serbia. Oh my God, yes, Serbia as well. So we may just just give up ourselves without posing any danger to his idea. So how do you see this future of this region?
You make me want to cry. So I don't know. I mean, do you have a?
I can't really speak to Central Europe, but I would be worried. I am, yeah. I mean, what could... But,
Yeah, I guess that what my answer to you would be in terms of what I said at the end of what I tried to my remarks was that Meloni, right, and Brothers of Italy are not part of the Patriots, right? The Patriots is this coalition where you have the National Rally and Lega Salvini Premier. So Vannacci, the general I just talked about, he's part of the Patriots, which is orchestrated by Orban's, right? And I would see them as pro-Russia. Yes, it's the third voting bloc in the European Parliament right now. But Meloni stayed out of that coalition, right? Meloni took her 30% and went with the Conservatives for Europe. And I think that before we see Putin taking Ukraine, Meloni is like the European Union. I don't think is going to necessarily let that happen. Even if in terms of money allocated to this, because of energies and because of other the economy itself of the European Union. Like, do you see what I'm like?
But the thing is, I don't think that Putin's going to take Ukraine. Putin is going to take parts of Ukraine, right? So. And that's the danger too, is that people are going to think, and there's fatigue, both in Ukraine and in the international community, and it's going to be, okay, well, let's give Putin the Donbass and Luhansk and Crimea is gone anyway, and then we're going to have some kind of peace. And actually, this is a dangerous scenario, because then he can rearm and come back in 10 years and 15 years and then go for the whole thing. But I'm not sure that there's a danger for the whole thing now, because there would be a strong opposition to that. The question is going to be more of how much to push Ukraine to cede to Russia at this moment, because of our own economic and political priorities. I had the feeling that also Meloni, but I guess I'm wrong, that she was also pro-Ukraine because the left is also pro-Russian in Italy. I mean, the left is not supportive of Ukraine. They have, absorbed this discourse of Putin that the Ukrainians are fascists, etc. So if she's fighting against the left and the rest of the right, then she's very small to be supportive of Ukraine.
Yeah, and I think, again, Salvini, which she needs to make the coalition in government, and Lega, Salvini, he's also pro-Russia, right? So,
Scott, we're going to give you the last word.
Okay, well, so 2 quick points. One is that there is kind of a solution available for Europe, which is not probably your normative preference, but you can solve a lot of different people's problems with essentially military Keynesianism. You can revive German industry, you can revive French defense contractors, you can give Britain a role, you can change a really depressing economic trajectory over the last 15 years. And you can hold off the day when Putin's head got out of being bogged down in half of Ukraine and starts to develop an interest in the nice, flat, thinly populated Baltic states, which no longer have American fighter jets over them. I think you could very well see a case for military Keynesianism. It would even have the bonus that Emmanuel Macron could justify the remaining 2 years of his presidency by trying to lead it. I think that all depends on what the German government does, because as long as the German government for another couple of months contains this sort of very small-minded post-debt crisis, debt break mentality, you're going to have a Europe that A, drifts, and B, doesn't do the state investment that is historically associated with growth in about most of half of the EU countries. But on a cheery note, we've come out of almost 20 years now in which every time anything bad happens to Europe, the English language press blasts out articles about the coming fragmentation of Europe and how the European Union is not going to hang together, and the Central Europeans will do this, and the Italians will flake out, and the French will fail to build a coalition, and the Germans will blah, 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 blah. They did the financial crisis, the refugee quote-unquote crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, the Ukraine war. It's been an exciting 15 years. Every single time, the European response was to band together more closely. Every single time the response was a stronger European Union with more integrated action, because every single time each of these member states looked at what the world is like when you're not within the European Union, and the British can help them understand that, and realized it's much worse. So that's a very negative case for European integration, but we're coming off a long period of time in which whenever we're told that Europe is about to fragment and become irrelevant, instead, Europeans get it together and act together.
So there's hope. And on that note, I want to thank our panelists, Scott Greer, Giulia Riccò, and Joshua Cole. And since we ended on a discussion on the war in Ukraine, I also want to invite everyone to come to a very important panel on Tuesday, December 3rd, so that's a Tuesday right after Thanksgiving weekend, where we're going to have a special panel on the future of Ukraine with the very recent Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs, specialists from the Atlantic Council. Who else? We have a Finnish, Ukrainian, 4 specialists, and they will summarize also the findings and recommendations that a team of international experts, policy experts, will present to the next U.S. administration. So please mark your calendar, 5 p.m. December 3rd, to discuss the future of Ukraine. Thank you very much.